Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Season 4 of Intimate Judaism. I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn. Over the past week, a few things have come up that demand reflection, and because it's Elul and because Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are right around the corner, we decided that these issues must be addressed, and this is the right place to address them. Among them are the very important and disturbing article in the Yeshiva University Commentator, where an anonymous writer alleges that she was raped, that the rape she reported to the university was swept under the rug, and that there is a rape culture at Yeshiva University as well. It's an extraordinarily difficult thing to read. While we're not going to focus on that article per se, the allegations raised there do raise the question about messaging about sex in religious institutions. So in addition, yeshiva students and seminary students are now arriving in Israel for their post-high school year or 2 or 3 of study. And Talli, you posted recently on Facebook about some of the messaging that they're receiving in their various seminaries and yeshivot, and that post received a fair bit of comment. So all of this made it clear to us that we really need to have an episode talking about messaging regarding sex in educational institutions.
Well, I definitely think that we need to talk about what's happening out there. We need to talk about education for consent. We need to talk about prevention. We need to talk about sexuality and sexual relationships in post-high school and in seminary and yeshivot and in college. It seems clear that there needs to be some sort of navigating around these areas for sure. What I posted, by the way, on Facebook, I wanted to know if people had heard of Night of Tears, because I had heard about it from some different sources and I wanted to understand it better. And I understood that you also had some feedback about Night of Tears, which we can talk about later. The other comment I want to make is just about language. And I'll probably say things throughout the podcast about how important it is to be sensitive to language, even when you said that this woman alleges that she was raped. So what I want to say about that is, on a technical level, certainly on a legal level, you're absolutely correct that it's alleged. But I think that when we respond to an exposure of a personal experience, especially when there hasn't been any names named, it's one thing if she came out and said, this name, Shimmy, whatever, Moishi, whatever, raped me. And then you could say, well, he allegedly raped you. You can't blame him yet because we don't really know the full story. But when a person comes with a story, I think that it might be better if we say, this woman reported on what happened to her. I think that that sounds better than the alleged rape, because alleged sheds some sort of doubt on her story.
It's actually interesting that you mentioned that. When I was writing in that introduction, I spent a long time thinking about that word, and I put it in, I erased it, and I put it back, not because I'm doubting the woman's report of her own experience, only because I was also referring to the other things she said, such as there's a rape culture at Yeshiva University. And while I'm not doubting this woman's own experience or her own report of what happened, the allegations about the university as a whole saying there is a rape culture goes beyond her own personal experience and extends to something which may or may not be true for other people. And for that, I think we can fairly say that's an allegation rather than a full report of something that actually is objectively true. So I agree with you. Perhaps the word alleges when it comes to her own experience is wrong, but for the other aspects of what she said, I think it's fair to say that, given that everything's anonymous. We don't know anything about anybody because there's no names over here. And I'm not blaming her. I understand completely why someone would want to be anonymous. It also means that when we're talking about an entire culture of university and extrapolating from what she says to the entire university, we can't start treating this as objective truth for everybody else. That's why I use the term alleges.
Well, again, I think that this points to the impact of language. And her saying that YU has a rape culture has a very strong effect on people as well. I think that my response to that wouldn't be, well, that's an allegation necessarily, but more, what is it that you're feeling walking down the halls of YU that is giving you that feeling? I mean, even rape culture, I don't even, that's a kind of a grandiose statement. And so I think that we want to really understand the meaning behind these statements, not so much whether or not that's true or not true. There's clearly something that has gone awry and that needs to be dealt with. And whether we call it a rape culture or we call it something else or we don't call it anything, what we need to call it is what you said in the beginning. This is a time of reflection, and we need to start reflecting on what's happening in institutions because we want our young people, young men and young women, to feel safe.
Absolutely. And I think what you're saying about language is definitely going to apply to what we're going to talk about in terms of messaging. In fact, a lot of what I want to say is that it comes down sometimes to the nature of the language that's used. Sometimes rabbis or other teachers might use language where they're quoting Chazal, they're quoting sages, they're quoting sources, and out of context or even within context, but in the context of that classroom, it might not be the language that should be used. We'll get to all this in a few minutes. First, let me remind you to please subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts and share Intimate Judaism to help us reach an ever-widening circle of people who want to have an honest and frank discussion of intimacy and Judaism. Make sure to visit our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah list, and more. And if this podcast has been helpful, you can get even more Intimate Judaism by becoming a Patreon subscriber. You'll get bonus material, episodes, merch, and more, and it's an opportunity for people who have benefited from Intimate Judaism to support this podcast. The link is in the description, as well as in the show notes. Please do it today. Send your questions and comments to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Also, make sure to visit www.jewishcoffeehouse.com and tallirosenbaum.com. As you may have noticed, we had some technical difficulties, so we're recording Talli over Zoom today. Next time, we'll get back to our regular high standard of recording. Talli, let me open up, perhaps, our discussion by mentioning some of the messaging that I have heard from my own experiences, from what I've seen, from what I've asked other people about, from what I've heard that goes on in some yeshivot and seminaries. And please, in the context of this, I want to advise the listeners, I'm not condemning yeshivot and seminaries. I believe that the year or more in Israel is a crucial part of a religious person's growth. I also think that there sometimes can be messaging in some places which is not healthy, and we need to work on that to make the experience as strong as possible. So I don't want someone to think that I'm condemning seminaries or yeshivot. In fact, last week I recorded an episode of the Orthodox Conundrum in which I talked about what goes on in yeshivot. It's a very positive discussion because that's what I believe. These two can coexist. We can say that something is very good while at the same time saying that in some places there needs to be improvement. Perhaps some yeshivot don't have these problems, some seminaries don't. I'm sure not all of them do, but I know that some of them do as well.
Are you specifically wanting to talk about messaging regarding sexuality, relationships, intimacy, or in general?
The answer is yes. Because this is Intimate Judaism, I'm specifically going to speak about sex and relationships and intimacy. However, some of the criticisms, which I'll mention, can be applied to other areas. However, I think it might be most acute regarding sex.
I'm thinking about our listeners, and I'm hoping that many of the people who are listening are also going to have some opinions and ideas. I think that we can predict that this might be the first of more than one conversation and possibly even a panel in the future. I will also predict that we'll get some different responses, and understanding that there is a spectrum of the different types of yeshivot and seminaries. At least I personally went to seminary literally like 40 years ago. So I'm really giving it away now. So I'm sure that in some ways there are things that have stayed the same, but I'm sure that many, many things have changed since I went to Michlala. And the only message I think was that we were not allowed to talk to BMT boys. And the response was, well, why would we want to? Because we're Michlala girls. And such is the hierarchy of the yeshivot versus which seminaries go with which yeshivot, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, my daughters go to midrashot, not seminaries. So I guess the messaging would be different there. I have heard clinically about some experiences which kind of led me to asking about Night of Tears, because you're right in there. You ran a yeshiva, so yeah. I'm sure you have a lot to tell us.
And I am fully complicit. I don't pretend that when I ran a yeshiva, I never made any of these mistakes. People who are making these mistakes, I believe, are really well-meaning. They're not trying to do something that's wrong. I think sometimes people are simply not trained in areas in which they're talking at certain points. There are rabbis and other teachers who are perhaps very, very good teachers in their specific field, whether it be Talmud or Chumash or whatever. when it comes to speaking about intimacy and sexuality, they might believe that they know more than they actually do, or they might not realize that some of their comments said innocuously or innocently can actually be damaging. Let's start talking about what some of those comments are and what some of that messaging is. But before we get there, perhaps you could explain what Night of Tears is, because frankly, until you posted about it on Facebook, I'd never heard of it.
Well, I raised it on Facebook because I wanted to understand, and I think that I understand it in two ways. One way is that in some, and we're not going to be naming any names. I mean, I know I named where I went to Vichlala, but that's about it. That's an objective. I went there. We're not going to be naming names of places. But what I understood is there are places where there is a talk that is given to the boys that they should be breaking up with their girlfriends. And Night of Tears is the night where boys all break up with their girlfriends, and their girlfriends in the seminaries are crying because their boyfriends have broken up with them. And then the parallel to that is also some sort of sicha, some sort of talk that girls get in certain seminaries about why they should be breaking up with their boyfriends. And that also results in this legendary Night of Tears.
And again, we're not speaking about any seminary or yeshiva in particular. We're speaking about trends that happen, call it what you will. It's interesting, though, Talli, in speaking about messaging, the messaging for those two types of Night of Tears are very different. The messaging from the boys' schools, the yeshivot, is probably, for the most part, you have to break up with your girlfriends because they're a distraction. They may be righteous, they may be much better than you, but you have to spend your time learning, and women, girls, are a distraction for you. On the other hand, the messaging for some of the seminaries for girls is not that the boys are a distraction, at least, again, I'm putting things into a very stereotypical framework over here, but largely the message is that men are pigs. They can't control themselves. And if you have a boyfriend, chances are you're eventually going to not be Shomer Negiah. And once you're not Shomer Negiah, all sorts of terrible things can happen. That's sort of the message over there. The guys can't control themselves, so be smart and break up with your boyfriend now. This all goes together with the messaging of, in general, when you're 18, 19, 20, stay away from the opposite gender. And also, another message that we heard about is that if you're not Shomer Negiah, if you are touching your boyfriend or your girlfriend, well, in some ways, that's kind of like having half a kizayit of pig. It is obviously against Torah law to eat pig. However, almost all the laws in the Torah have a minimum amount, a minimum shiur. So what happens if you have less than the minimum shiur? Let's say you eat only half a kizayit of pig when the minimum shiur, the minimum amount, is a full kizayit. The answer is, even though it's not punishable, nevertheless, it's still a violation, and a serious violation, of Torah norms. In the same way, it has been reported, some people receive the message that touching your boyfriend or your girlfriend is kind of like having less than the shiur, than the minimum amount of sexual intercourse. It's still sex, it's just kind of sex. It's like half sheer sex. These are all examples of messages that do exist in some yeshivot and seminaries. So my question for you is, what do you think about them? Are these damaging? Is it wrong to tell people to be Shomer Negiah, which is a value which I believe in? Is it wrong to tell students to stay away from the opposite gender?
Well, that's not what you said. What you said just now is a suggestion based on a certain value system. I mean, I think that nobody would second guess Rebbe's in the mirror if they said stay away from girls. That would be completely acceptable because they're not expected to hang around with girls. So that's, I think, a reasonable value to have if those are your values. In the modern Orthodox world, there is a place for gender interaction. And if that is the case, we need to teach our kids how to correctly navigate those interactions. It is quite disturbing to hear messages such as, women are a distraction and men are pigs. I mean, those are really, really disturbing messages.
It's interesting, though, because even though some of the young women are being given the message that guys are pigs and guys can't control themselves, the guys themselves are getting very often a very, very different message, namely that they must control themselves and that they do have agency and they do have self-control that they must put to use. So I think that guys are very much being told that they have the ability to control themselves, and ironically, sometimes they're being told that they have more agency than they might really have. I don't want to try to minimize anyone's personal control over his or her body, but using the example of masturbation, And I want to thank Zev Gantz because I spoke to Dr. Zev Gantz today, a friend of mine, about some of these issues. He's spoken at some yeshivot and to some yeshiva teachers about how they frame their messaging, and he has some strong ideas about this. As he put it, the messaging for guys in yeshivot is often framed in one of two ways. Either very negatively, to be scared of their own sexuality, that you're broken, that you need to hold it in, you need to control yourself, what they call shmirat habrit, being careful of the brit milah, you have to quash it. And very often, 18 and 19-year-olds are, I don't want to say completely incapable, but it's extraordinarily difficult. It's something which the majority of them, perhaps the vast majority of them, are not really able to do on a regular basis, to completely control themselves in every way, never look at a girl, never masturbate. It's hard to say that they're all having this complete control over themselves, and yet at the same time, the messaging they're being given in yeshivot, and as I've mentioned before, in my own yeshiva, I gave this message too. Okay, you live and learn. The messaging is often very negative in the sense that you must control yourself, and you're saying this to people who may be racked with guilt because they feel either incapable of controlling themselves or like terrible people going to hell because they can't. The other messaging, though, that Zev pointed out, which sometimes is better but isn't perfect either, is for the teachers effectively to ignore it. Kind of a don't ask, don't tell. That I know you're watching porn, I know you're masturbating, let's just pretend you're not or not talk about it at all. So even though on the one hand, that's perhaps better, or it probably is better than a negative messaging, it doesn't alleviate the guilt. And it sort of means this is a shameful thing and we can't talk about it. And I don't want to talk about it. And you are left on your own to deal with it if you're an 18-year-old. What Zeb pointed out to me, and I think he's right, is that the best way for a teacher or for a rabbi to message, to give a message over, is to be open about it, to have a relationship where students feel comfortable talking about their problems or whatever it is that's bothering them, including issues of sexuality, and not pretending that there's an answer. To say, yes, we live in dynamic tension. To say, yes, it's really, really hard. And the Torah also says that you have to control yourself. And perhaps in the same way that, this is Zeb's example with which I agree, with Lashon Hara, there is an ideal that we look up to, but it's very rare for a person to say, I've never spoken Lashon Hara in my life. People somehow are able to accept that it's an ideal that we strive towards. And at the same time, I know I'm not always going to get there. Without at all denying the obligatory nature of mitzvot, we have to also simultaneously live in that tension, that feeling that these are ideals for which we strive and which we know are the way we should be, and we also fall short. That's part of being human. That's why every single year we have Yom Kippur as opposed to once a lifetime, because we know that every year we are going to try again, and yet at the same time we're going to fall short, and that's what it means to be a human being. That's what it means to be a Jew, to try to reach something while at the same time recognizing that we are going to fall short at a certain point, and that does not negate our value as human beings. When it comes to sexuality, so often there's so much guilt associated with it that this message becomes doubly important. As Zev puts it, I think the very best rabbis as well would really try, the very best teachers would acknowledge that tension, to say this is something that the Torah says, and yeah, it's really hard. Allow people to see it as something which they strive for, and to acknowledge that there isn't necessarily supposed to be an answer. It's not necessarily supposed to be so simple. So guys are getting this messaging that they can control themselves when maybe, when it comes to things that happen in the privacy of their own room, it's really, really difficult. That's very, very different than saying guys can't control themselves vis-a-vis another human being, which is a different matter entirely. So here we have this dichotomy that guys are being taught that yes, they can control themselves about things which, I don't want to say they can't control themselves, but which are very likely to be somewhat out of their control. Meanwhile, they're also receiving the message vis-a-vis girls that the same way they must control themselves, which obviously is a good message, while at the same time, the girls are receiving the message that guys can't control themselves. Forget in the privacy of their room, they also can't control themselves vis-a-vis you.
Very disturbing what you're saying about the messages that girls are getting. Relieved to hear that boys are being told that they are in control of themselves, if that's what you say. Look, I'm listening to all this, and a part of me is just really feeling sad. You know, there's something very negative about the whole messaging around sexuality. There's this dissonance, this cognitive dissonance between the way that sex, masturbation, girls, women are talked about. And then there's this expectation that after marriage, somehow sexuality is beautiful and natural and wonderful. And I think that it's difficult to make that transition when there's so much negativity. I do think that we need to be able to educate differently about sex, not talk about it in terms of chatzi shir of pig or whatever. All of this kind of pig-related similes. Pigs are considered to be like averse to the Jewish experience.
Yeah, there's a
And
lot of
so,
pig talk here.
yeah. And I mean, I think that being able to talk about sexuality and desire as completely normal and, a sign that you're alive and that it's good to want to be curious and to want to feel intimacy, connection with another person and to normalize it and to not demonize it so much and to not bring it down to its most base levels of can you control it or can you not control it. It's not all about controlling yourself. It's also about expressing yourself. And sometimes you can express yourself. Some of it may be with some amount of touch, but sometimes even without touch, you can express yourself in a very healthy, intimate way to a member of the opposite sex with whom you are interested in engaging with. And it doesn't have to be brought to such a, I don't know, such a kind of like dirty place.
I agree. And I still want to get to the YU discussion because that's very important. But before we get there, I also want to mention something else. I want to discuss with you a little bit where this messaging comes from. Why is it that teachers often have such stark messaging? What the sources are? Maybe you have your own opinions, but I've been thinking a lot about this. And I think there might be at least two reasons that some teachers have this kind of way of messaging. The first one is kind of difficult to talk about because it's messaging that comes from directly within our own sources. For example, when I talk about masturbation, before this podcast, I wanted to remind myself of what it says in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which is a classic, relatively recent, but important source. And its language when it comes to masturbation is extraordinarily stark. If you'll indulge me, I'll just read and translate quickly in English as I'm doing it. For those who are curious, since Siman Kuf Nun Aleph in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch 151, it says it's forbidden to spill seed in vain, and this sin is more serious than all sins in the Torah. And those who commit adultery with their hand and spill seed in vain, it's not enough that it's a tremendous violation, but someone who does this is also excommunicated. About him, the Pasuk says, your hands are filled with blood, and it's as if he killed a soul. As a punishment for this, God forbid, his children die when they're young, or they'll be wicked people, or he'll become poor. That is the language of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch.
Maybe you can just explain for our listeners a little bit about the evolution of halacha in terms of the original sources and where the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is placed in that timeline.
I'm glad you asked that.
Why that's important.
Let's just say, first of all, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, although it's an important source, it's not considered an overly authoritative source. But the reason I read the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is because he's reflecting opinions that appear elsewhere as well. He simply says it in a nice terse way that makes the point very, very clear. If someone disagrees with the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, no one gets crazy because he's not considered that serious an authority that you can't disagree with him. On the other hand, he does reflect a very serious and real stream within Judaism. To me, a lot of the negative messaging, and I say negative messaging, I think that's pretty negative over there about something like masturbation, comes from mystical sources, from the Kabbalistic tradition, from the Zohar. And I've said this before, and I think it's a serious problem, that ideas in the Zohar, which I value highly, I'm not knocking the Zohar is wonderful, but I think bringing it in as a halachic source can lead to problems. And particularly once we take language from, and here we're with language again, taking language that is used in a very specific context from mystical sources and applying it and using it as a means of teaching an 18-year-old who doesn't understand that it comes from a mystical source, and Chazal did not use that same stark language in the same kind of way. We have to acknowledge and understand where it comes from. Mystical sources are extremely important hashkafically, philosophically. They are less authoritative, I believe, halachically. I'll even say you could go even further. Even if we have stylistic flourishes in Chazal, even going back to the Talmud, you have to understand the context in which they said it and the way in which they talk. Let me give one simple example from Brachot Daf Daled Amud Bet, page 4b. Our sages say that somebody who comes home from work and instead of davening Ma'ariv right away, instead he says, I'll have something to eat, I'll have something to drink, and then I'll go to sleep, and I'll daven Ma'ariv afterwards. If he does that, he is chayav mitah. He is liable for the death penalty. And That's obviously not literally true. No one is being put to death for not davening Marav on time. They're making a rhetorical point. And sometimes we forget that rhetorical points are there to strengthen an idea. And even though perhaps that's not the language that 1,500 years later or 2,000 years later we would use making that rhetorical point, we have to remove the language from the idea. The idea is, to put it simply, it's very important to daven Marav before you go to sleep at night, because otherwise you're going to forget and you'll sleep all night and you won't be able to daven Marav. That's the point. Saying you're chayav mita, it's a capital crime. I know the Chazal did not mean that literally. That is not their point. And there are many other examples. Sometimes we have to take the language they use and extract the idea and understand that language evolves. And the language they use, and I'll say even the language that the Zohar or the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch used, is language rather than describing an objective reality. But when rabbis or teachers start taking the language literally, imagine if they started telling their students, oh, you're davening Marav after taking a nap. Sorry, you're chayav mita. There's no more reason for me to teach you anymore because basically you're a lost cause. We'd all say that's absurd. But they are saying that on some level when they talk about masturbation and saying, yeah, you're basically killing people. And by the way, saying you're killing people, this is something which I personally have heard people say.
Yeah, well, people use it, I better bring the car home on time or my father's going to kill me.
Exactly.
People do use that language, and I'm really happy to hear you. If I'm reflecting back correctly, I'm really hearing you say that we don't need to take those threats seriously. We just need to understand that Chazal felt that these were serious issues, but we don't need to take that threat in a serious way.
I would say we need to take the idea seriously, but
Right.
take the threat as a figurative way of demonstrating the seriousness of the issue.
So in fact, the expectation to never masturbate at all because of fear of death is actually a corruption of the meaning of Chazal.
When you take Chazal literally, when it's not meant to be taken literally, you are corrupting the idea. When a rabbi says, as I have heard, that when a person dies, when a man dies and he has masturbated, even once, all of those sperm, which are now souls that were not born, come after him yelling, hey, Dad, how come you killed me? When you are told that, and that is said in yeshivot, I don't know if anymore, but it used to be, that's for sure, that is not just damaging messaging, it's corrupting the intent of what was originally said. Because it's taken out of context.
Here's also what I'm wondering, and I think that there are people who might have this experience and support it. If you're a kid, you're 18 and you're hearing this stuff, it just seems like this is the stuff of going OTD, as they say. Like when you hear this kind of stuff, and obviously you can't not masturbate ever, and if you do, you feel like you've killed someone. If you sort of have to buy that package, it is going to skew all of your beliefs, particularly around sexuality. And so what I'm wondering about is if you are in the experience of being in yeshiva and, you're learning and you're into it and you're believing and experiencing what growth is, you would really like to have the experience of yeshiva, but you almost have to put the sexual messages and say, look, I either have to buy into this, which some maybe succeed to do, or I have to just not buy into this. And that may account for the idea of not buying into anything that anybody is saying about sex and sexuality. In other words, what I wanted to say when you're talking about masturbation, what was going through me is like, I can't believe we're still talking about masturbation, because what we really need to be talking about is a very real and existent hookup culture in yeshivot and seminaries. And I'm speaking from some amount of inside knowledge. I'm not saying that this is a huge phenomenon, but from talking to the demographic, there is a clubbing, hooking up, getting super drunk kind of experience that is become part of the gap year yeshiva seminary year. And I wonder really if it comes from somewhat of a black or white approach that everything else I can be from, but in this area, obviously, if I can't masturbate, then I can't not go hooking up either.
Well, if you look at the sources, it actually, if you keep going with this, again, this is not to be taken literally, but simply put, it's probably better to hook up than to masturbate. If someone decides to take that message literally, then, well, you're right. I don't know how often that happens. I do wonder if it's really true that as a result of this messaging, people will go off the derech, will become OCD, or as a result of this, they say, well, I may as well just hook up because what difference does it make? It's even better. But certainly that is an issue. It certainly is possible based on the messaging. It's certainly implicit in the messaging. Whether or not it actually happens as a result, that I wouldn't know. I want to actually mention one more thing, Talli, though, about another type of messaging. And I think I'm probably going to get some hate mail because of this. But at the same time, I think it's important to mention, apart from the fact that taking the messaging and the threats literally is a violation or a distortion of what they really mean, there's something else that has to be said, that even sometimes when things are said literally in certain sources, we're allowed to say, yes, but that's not how we hold. We can reject that particular idea. And this obviously might sound controversial if you say that something in the Rambam, I'm sorry, we don't agree with that. And I'll give you an easy example. In Hilchot Ishut, Perkaf Aleph, halacha Yud, 21:10, the Rambam says that your wife has to obey the husband, and if she doesn't do certain things, you can get her to obey with the rod. That's a quote. The Ravid, of course, on the spot says that's not true. I never heard of such a thing. Are people going to say, well, the Rambam says you can discipline your wife with a stick? Do we hold by that? Obviously, and I certainly hope that no one will agree with that nowadays, and yet the Rambam said it. I think there's a point sometimes of saying, and this is even going further than what I said before about taking the language out of context, sometimes we have to understand the historical context in which the Rambam was speaking, and we don't anymore accept his idea of beating a wife. In the same way that it's pretty easy for most of us to say that when the Rambam says it's a mitzvah to love and fear God, and the way you do that is by studying science, and here's what science says about the universe, and he spends 2 chapters explaining the Aristotelian understanding of the universe, which we now know is not true. Most people in the modern Orthodox or Dati Leumi world are okay saying, okay, that was the Rambam science. We don't accept that science. We can also extract the larger point, which is you have to love and fear God by studying the world. The Rambam science we can reject. Okay, along with that, we can also extract that which we need to extract without saying, therefore you can beat your wife. And that comes as well in all of this messaging. We can say, fine, the Torah says don't masturbate. Let's even posit that the mystical sources that say that a person who masturbates is killing all of these souls, etc., etc. Let's posit that that was meant literally, not what I said before. Let's assume that no, the author actually meant it literally. That does not obligate all of us to accept that passage of the Zohar literally as well. We're occasionally allowed to say that certain things are not the way that we accept because we do that all the time, even if we don't like to admit it.
Look, I think that is actually very brave of you to say this and very creative, because it now allows for the acknowledgement that we're no longer living in the 12th century Spain, and that we're no longer living in a historical context where really things were different. Things were different in relationships between men and women. And I'd like to say that for the most part, the Torah wants to protect and go above the way things were at the time. But now in contemporary society, we need to be able to adapt to a different society, not necessarily accepting certain things that were very usual in that period of time, such as hitting your wife or that kind of thing, but also going further and saying, look, we have to talk about sexual education. We have to talk about what educators have been afraid to talk about, which is if you are going to be engaging in sexual activity, and hello, many are, how can we do that using the Jewish ethics of consent and respect and boundaries and permission? How can we do that in an ethical and a safe way?
And without giving the message that the Torah says it's okay too. That's what the rabbi's always afraid of. That by saying, if you're going to be involved in sexual activity, this is how you should do it. He's afraid by giving those ethics over, he's basically implicitly allowing it. That's the fear.
I understand that fear. I do. But these things are happening. And the problem is that because kids have internalized that message about it being bad and wrong, and that they're guilty because of it, they go ahead and do it in a state of complete drunkenness or without the proper conversations. So I think it would be far better to talk about how to navigate sexual relationships in a Jewish way, even if we can recognize that in the days where these rules were set in place, people married really young, and people aren't marrying at 15, 16 anymore. So we do have to recognize that there's going to be sexual activity taking place. It is taking place, but it's really, really disturbing to hear about drunk hookups and to hear about rapes.
So that's a good entry point into the discussion about the YU article. What do you think the messaging is there, and what do you feel about what this victim wrote in her article?
Well, first of all, I think that what we can learn from what she wrote is that very often, and I think this is true for many victims of some sort of sexual violence or abuse, that there's almost two traumatic experiences. There's the experience of what happens, and then there's the experience of being shut up or not being believed or being told that it can't be proven. I think that so many people were so outraged by the article because of the lack of accountability. I think that the proper response, and I understand a lot of the people who say, well, it is her word against him and da 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 da. And what do you expect? I mean, on my Facebook, where people were talking about it, there was a discussion about how the institutions have to be made safer by protecting men and women, by separating them more, by having, stricter boundaries, external artificial boundaries
between genders.
Because when you put horny boys and girls together, what do you expect is going to happen? Mm-hmm. And of course, that is a message which, by the way, I was talking to my girlfriend about this. She's very smart. And she said, look, the woke left has the same message. When they say believe all women, they're putting men in a position of, well, of course they did it.
Of course they did it. Men are pigs.
Right. So it's basically the same men are pigs message. The extreme right and the extreme left, that's what's going on in the world today. These are the positions that people take. So obviously we need some nuance here. We need to recognize that men need to be safe. They need to be safe from the possibility of being framed as rapists when this was not their intention. And women for sure need to be, and they have more of a need to be safe, because there is a hierarchy in terms of men being stronger, men having more power. And so there certainly is an important value in believing women. But I also think that the response should have been, wow, this should not happen and nobody should feel unsafe. And we really need to be doing something about this and not going to the non-disclosure agreement. The most important thing is that nobody finds out about this. Right. This is when I go back to thinking about some of the patients who I've worked through victimization with, and a lot of them, the messages that they got, actually, this was a seminary girl who was molested on a bus. And she went back to her seminary and told them and described the man. And they said, oh, we know who this guy is. He's married with 5 children. You cannot ruin his life. It's fine. He doesn't mean anything by it. Just forget about it. That's what she was told. And another young woman who went to her mother to tell her about what happened. And her mother said, it's not so bad. Let's not make a big deal. You're going to ruin your shidduchim if somebody finds out. Like, you're going to be ruined. Try to get over it, because she didn't say, I don't believe you. She said, I believe you, but just forget about it, because if people find out, it's going to reflect badly on you. So I think that understanding that the response to the exposure of a sexual assault can be just as traumatic or even more than the assault itself. And I think that that's part of why.
And the writer even said that.
Outraged
the writer
so
said it
people.
Explicitly.
Yeah, she did say that. And the other thing that she said was that there were guys from the basketball team who did call her a slut and a whore. So that real fear of being told, well, what did you expect? And so I think that question of what do you expect begs the consent conversations that we need to have. So I'll give you, it's interesting because I think you kind of alluded to this earlier. I was talking to my husband about this too. People like to go down to that conversation about ein apotropos le'araya. Nobody can trust themselves. So my husband said, yeah, that means nobody can trust themselves in a consensual situation. You better damn well trust yourself when it's not consensual. Mm-hmm. That's not what ein apotropos le'araya means.
It's not a license to violence to say, well, that's excusable. Absolutely. Because you can't trust yourself. Right.
So I said, okay, I'm quoting you on that because that was very insightful for me. That's very important.
Yeah, I think so. And it's interesting. You talk a lot about nuance. And I think that's such an important idea. First of all, when you talk about nuance vis-a-vis the specific article and how we look at it, it's very hard to do because on the one hand, you have to hold two truths in your hand at once. On the one hand, as you correctly articulate, we believe the victim. This is her experience. This is what happened to her. Unless we have reason to believe otherwise, she's telling the truth. We have to assume that. We have to also equally hold in our hand the fact that everyone here is anonymous, and her claim that this is a wider problem and a broader problem, that doesn't negate her experience to say, if it is a broader and wider problem at Yeshiva University in general that transcends her personal experience, in order to condemn the entire institution, I think we need to have a little more evidence that it's not just her. By the way, that doesn't mean that one case is not that much. That's not what I'm saying at all. One case is too much. But to say therefore,
it's not one case.
Right, that's
Scott. This stuff has been happening. It's been happening. It happens all the time. It happens on gap year programs, and it happens in yeshivas and seminaries. It happens that there are these incidents, and they get hushed up.
And that's terrible. And it's hushed up for all the wrong reasons. Or, for example, that example you gave with the woman or the girl who was molested and her mother said, please don't do it for your own sake. She had good motivations, even if it's traumatic for the daughter. It may not have been a good result, but the mother wasn't trying to protect anybody except for her own daughter, the victim, even though that perhaps might not have been the right way of doing it.
Well, the mother was uneducated. The mother was uneducated. She was, again, her reaction was based on a belief that if you got touched, you are damaged goods. These are important messages. It's important to recognize that these are the messages that make women feel guilty and bad and that they've done something wrong. And that's the difference between this woman and YU today, because this has happened. I cannot tell you how many times a woman has come into my office and said, I didn't want to, I didn't mean to, but I ended up having sex. And she's basically describing a rape, but she doesn't see it as a rape because, but I didn't scream. I didn't push him away. Well, you didn't push him away because you were in stress, fight, flight, freeze response place and you froze. And probably what happened to this woman too, this guy's a basketball player for heaven's sakes, and he's coercing her. He's saying, come on, it'll be fun. That's not seduction. That's not her saying, okay,
that's not consent.
It's not consent, not by any means. And I think this woman was able to say, I was raped. But so many women who go through the exact same experience don't say that. They say, I went all the way. I didn't mean to. I don't know what happened. I couldn't say no.
I agree with you completely. I just mean that we often look at the people who are hushing things up as these wicked, terrible people who only have their own interests in mind. That is certainly sometimes true. Sometimes it can be someone like this girl's uneducated mother who has the victim's best interests in mind, just did the wrong thing in the process of doing that. But it's not that they're all necessarily bad people. That's not what we're trying to say. It could be that good people are doing something really, really wrong out of a lack of education because perhaps they don't have the proper messaging, which I think does bring us to the idea of what would be good messaging and what needs to be done.
Right, because that's not good enough anymore. In other words, a place like YU or an institution, especially one that's funded by the government, it's not enough. Like, we have to be proactive in providing safety and having discussions about sexual consent and what that means and what it means to violate that. And those have to be in place. And when there is a report of something not being in place, it has to be dealt with, first of all, with empathy, with understanding, with, wow, something went wrong here, with reflection. We're talking about this being a time of reflection. And do you know that all the Jewish movements, the conservative movement, the reform movement, they are all now in the process of reflecting on the sexual violence in their own communities. And we need to be doing that in the Orthodox community as well. We need to take stock. We need to reflect. We need to say, al chet, because things have gone wrong and we need to repair it. We need to repair it so that these kinds of things don't happen. They are shocking and they are heartbreaking.
So let's talk about some of the positive messaging, some of the messaging that should be given instead of the wrong kind of messaging. Because certainly one problem, as you say, is our institutions have to be better about addressing the events once they've already happened, whether it's sexual assault, whether it's sexual harassment, any sort of violence. once it's already happened, to hush it up is the wrong way of dealing with it. That's on an institutional level. But for educators who might be listening to this right now, who want to know, how am I supposed to speak about sexuality in such a way that I can give the right message so that hookup culture will not be accepted? It won't be something that goes on. Rape culture certainly won't be accepted, won't be something that goes on without giving the negative sexual messaging. I can tell you what Dr. Gantz told me, which I think is, or at least as I interpret him, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he said the idea of giving a broad message is often damaging, because when you get up there and give what might be called in yeshivot a shir klali, a class to the entire yeshiva talking about sex X, sex Y, sex Z, whatever thing you're trying to say, whether it's about masturbation or hookups or anything else, you are giving broad messaging, and that has impact and consequences that you may not be able to trace. You don't know where it's going to go. Even something as simple as saying that women are a distraction, it's true. If you have a girlfriend, that will distract you from your learning because you have to talk to her every day or whatever else. So yes, having a girlfriend can be a distraction when you're in full-time learning, the same way that having male friends can also be a distraction. At the same time, saying that phrase, women are a distraction, your girlfriend is a distraction, is an extraordinarily objectifying method of describing women. The rabbi isn't thinking in those terms probably, but that's a messaging that can go much further. So it might be very important that rabbis make themselves available, and I'll say something different in a moment about what I mean by rabbis, make themselves available for private, nuanced conversations for individuals rather than for a whole group where that broad messaging is inevitable. And my next point is this, Talli, before I hand it over to you. When I talk about rabbis, this is sort of a pet peeve of mine, and I've seen it over and over, and it's a real problem, which is that when kids come to yeshiva, they're 18, 19, they are in hero worship mode. They often believe that their teachers in yeshiva or seminary are absolute geniuses. And some of them are, but frankly, no more than in any other profession. And because they look up to them, and these rabbis or teachers know more than the student will often look at them in some way like a Rabbi, like this oracle, someone who knows everything. That's fine as long as the rabbi himself can laugh at that and realize it's not true. But I have seen, there are certainly many, many who don't do this, but sometimes it happens that the rabbi himself starts to believe his own PR. He starts to believe the very fact that they look up at me like this means that I am more knowledgeable in certain areas than I really am. And rabbis will start saying things and discussing areas where they have no business talking. They should be staying in their lane, and instead they start talking about areas where they simply don't have the knowledge. They start making psychological pronouncements about men and women. They start talking about sex in ways in which they're not trained. And that can be very damaging because they come at the top of the mountain as an oracle, telling people this is how you have to behave. And along with the negative messaging, even if they were to speak privately, they don't know what they're talking about. And I think teachers have to start learning what they are qualified to talk about and what they're not qualified to talk about.
Yeah, I agree with you. Look, I don't think that I can make any kind of grandiose pronouncements here. I think that we're talking about several areas. We're talking about not just rabbis and educators, although there's a lot to talk about there. I think that there's a lot more that can be gained by listening and not just talking, and listening and understanding. But I think we're also talking about parents who send their kids off to yeshiva and seminary without necessarily having conversations, and the value of having conversations about responsible behavior, responsible dating, how to, navigate relationships if you are in one and you also want to learn at the same time, and maybe asking more questions rather than pronouncements. And also, I want to say the kids themselves. In other words, we're talking about the kids without addressing the kids in terms of their own accountability in the hookup culture that you mentioned. You said, what can educators do about the hookup culture? Well, clearly they are not doing very much. I mean,
Right.
they're whatever it is they are doing isn't helping very much. Now, I'm not even going to talk in any kind of judgmental way about hooking up, but I am going to talk in a judgmental way about hooking up with alcohol. Because when you do that, you really take away your own ability to place boundaries on what you're doing. And without quoting our source, we do have a source in this demographic who we checked with. And she said that getting knocked out drunk and picking up a guy is just something that's almost even expected, was the words that she used. And I think we have to understand more about that. I personally don't feel like I'm an expert as to why this is happening. And if it is happening, I would want to understand what it's about. I think that, maybe it's just fun, but it is risky. And I think that we do have to talk to kids about how to navigate sexual relationships in a safe way. And also, you know what? We can talk about pleasure in a positive way too. We can talk about connection in a positive way and intimacy and relationships. Let's not forget, if we're talking about 18-year-olds or 19-year-olds, it's not that many years before they're going to be dating seriously or getting married. So the idea is that we don't want to create a dissonance where everything before dating for marriage is dirty and drunk and non-consensual maybe, or questionably consensual. And then when you're dating for marriage, it's like all pure and perfect. And of course, somehow the sexuality is just without any sort of challenge.
It gets transformed suddenly.
Yeah. So I think that we have to really recognize that part of developmental growth is going to be a difference in the type of relationships that you have. But if you are having relationships, you want to be able to navigate them. And you want to do that with really talking about consent and what that is. What does that mean? When somebody says, okay, let's fool around, and then in the middle they say no, then no is no. It's not consent. And if you are somehow pushing yourself, there are those who would say this isn't about I was too horny, like I couldn't control myself. There are those who would say you have just felt so entitled to use your power as the guy to make this happen after she had said no. And there are those who will say this isn't about sex. This is very much about power.
Talli, this was a very difficult episode in many ways, but I think it's important. And I hope that students in yeshivot and seminaries and college will listen to this and share it because, as you said, for most of the episode, we were talking to their parents and teachers. But above all, I think the people who need to hear this are those who are involved themselves and who are directly affected by either the negative messaging or perhaps hopefully positive messaging, and those who are involved in hookup culture or affected by hookup culture. There's certainly a lot more to discuss about this very important issue. If you would like us to do a follow-up episode or perhaps have a panel, please let us know by writing to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Remember to subscribe to Patreon. And Talli, I think we should do a Q&A in the next couple of weeks for our Patreon subscribers. Maybe we'll do one at some point in the next month, right?
Sure, sounds great.
Okay, so we will be doing that. Remember to go to intimatejudaism.com, subscribe to the podcast.
And wait, we didn't forget the course. It's in progress. We know that we keep promising that we're going to have a course. And Bezrat Hashem, we are working on it.
We will soon be announcing when that will be and what it will entail. It's going to be very good, so make sure you look for that. Thank you again for listening. Please share the podcast. Shana Tova.
Take care and Shana Tova.